Hey everybody, welcome to lab number 8, the spinal cord, reflexes, and peripheral nerves. There are not that many things in this lab, but things you definitely need to pay attention to compared to the other labs. So first, as you saw in the introduction, we have the spinal cord, anatomy and histology. That's mostly anatomy from the models, a little histology, meaning microscopes, a slide. Then we have peripheral nerves, naming a few of those, their anatomy, and histology, another slide. Definitely not slides like you had in labs 1 and 2. So this histology, pretty easy for veteran students like yourselves. Then we have autonomic reflexes, somatic reflexes, and cerebellar function. Make sure that you pay attention in the list of things to know what you are responsible for here. Be very literal in that. This oftentimes provides confusion to many students, so make sure you know what you're responsible for each one of these reflexes and the testing of the cerebellum. These first two items are really straight naming parts on a slide. Now, some people comment once in a while, it seems like I'm sort of shouting when I make these labs. Now, yes, I do turn on the teacher voice, but they have really cranked up the air handling systems here, and it's sort of hard for me to talk over them. Now, I know I have my microphone and it's set on maximum gain, so hopefully the audio is okay with you people, but just this week they have really ramped up the air handling, so it's kind of loud in here, but I resisted the urge to bring in a bullhorn or something like that. So I have my clip-on microphone, and let's hope that that works all right. So that's why it seems like I'm sometimes yelling in here. But don't get me wrong, I can lecture to a room packed full of people just fine. That's the teacher thing. So let's jump into lab number 8, and we'll start right out with spinal cord anatomy, because when we have anatomy and histology, just like when we have anatomy and a dissection, always best to do the models first. So we'll start with spinal cord models. So here we have a model of the human spinal cord. And as you will notice, I have a bunch of models of the spinal cord. Actually, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 really good ones. 6, if you count the super good one, we will see in a little bit. But none of the models are perfect. As is often the case, we'll see some structures on this model right here that we can't see on others. Some we see on the others that we can't see here. So it will seem like we're jumping around a little bit here anatomically, so follow along with me in your lab manual. Let's begin on page number 1, looking at this complete spinal cord model, and I'll talk about what things we can see here first off. Now I'm just going to point at a few, and then we will zoom in on some of them. So I can see the spinal cord itself right here. I can see the cauda equina or equina down here, a bunch of intercostal nerves, and a sympathetic chain, along with the filum terminale, some various structures that can be seen quite easily on this model. But from this distance, the camera distance, you might not be able to see them so well, so let me zoom in a good bit on this spinal cord model. And I want to focus your attention, in fact I'm forcing you to focus your attention, on the spinal cord's lower section right here. You'll see this gouge that I'm running my pointer in. That's actually the first anatomical structure on page 1 listed, the anterior median fissure. Nobody, that's my wagging finger there, nobody, myself included, is likely to ask you anterior median fissure on this model. It can be shown much better on others. But a few things I can see quite nicely here if we continue looking down the list. Notice right here how the spinal cord begins to narrow, actually coming to its terminus, the end of the spinal cord, about right there where my finger is. Now what I want you to notice, what I want you to see, is the fact that the spinal cord makes a little triangle right here. See where this number 14 is? Notice how we get a triangular shape at the bottom of the spinal cord right here. This structure, in 3 dimensions, it's a cone. So look for the term conus medullaris. That's what this is right here. Allow me to try to show it to you a little better with my probe. So notice how the spinal cord makes a triangle with the point right here where the number 14 is, conus medullaris. Find that term. Notice extending downward from the conus, right, right here, and you see it has a number written on it, and it goes all the way down, farther down than we can see right here. That is called the filum terminale, the terminal filament, Latinized. So conus medullaris right here, filum terminale, which is actually a piece of tissue that comes all the way down and anchors this spinal cord so it doesn't go wagging around too much down here at the bottom. We don't want our spinal cord swinging around like a pendulum. So conus medullaris, filum terminale. You will see both those terms on the left-hand side of page number 1. You will also see the term I mentioned before, and you'll hear it in your lectures, the cauda equina, the horse's tail. Cauda means tail, equine means horse, and if I do a little camera work, you can see as the spinal cord descends, it suddenly becomes, right past the conus here, just a bunch of dangling nerves. Somebody saw this whole structure right here and thought it looked like the tail of a horse. So this is the cauda equina. The filum terminale is right in the center of that, as you see it. So cauda equina, filum terminale, conus medullaris. Some of the first structures that are visible on this particular spinal cord model that shows us the whole cord. 2 other things that we can see on this model, which are on the right-hand side of page number 1, are the sympathetic chain and the sympathetic chain ganglion. I want you to notice over here, as you look at it on the left-hand side of this model, a group of nervous structures that are somewhat pinkish in color on this model. Here, 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 and so on. Each one of these structures is what we call a ganglion, an area of gray matter outside the central nervous system. The spinal cord is central nervous system. Once we exit the spinal cord, we're in the peripheral nervous system. This pink bulge that you see right here is a ganglion. These are ganglions for the sympathetic division, so more than one of these together is the sympathetic chain, it's called. So you'll see that term, that sort of shorthand, to call all of this the sympathetic chain. One individual bulge is a sympathetic ganglion. So the sympathetic chain or sympathetic chain ganglia, plural, one only is a sympathetic ganglion. And it would be on the other side also. You don't just have it on one side, it's just that the model only shows it on one side. The only other feature of note on this particular model is something we find on page 2 of your lab manual, some of the peripheral nerves. So as we look at the model, and I want you to see my probe, notice these nerves that run between the ribs. Right next to these intercostal muscles, these are intercostal nerves. So look on page 2 of your lab manual, the left-hand side under peripheral nerve anatomy, and you will see intercostal nerves. Sympathetic ganglion, sympathetic chain, intercostal nerves. So go over this particular model a few times. These are the things I can ask you from this spinal cord model. What we see here is a fairly standard look for a lot of spinal cord models. This is one that's cut in section. Anterior side, notice the vertebral body from back in lab number 3. Posterior side, notice the bifid spinous process, so this is from the cervical region, isn't it? Now there are a lot of structures I can see here from page 1 in your lab manual. So let's take a look at some of those, but we need to zoom in a little bit on the actual cord. So here's a nice view right here. And before I start naming anything, here's what I want to ask you to do. Look at this image, about as nice as I can make it, I think. And I want you to see the butterfly. Can you see the butterfly in this picture? Well, I think you can, and this is not a Dwayneism, this isn't something that just I say. Everybody says that this looks sort of like a butterfly. What I'm referring to, of course, is right here. This is the gray matter, collections of cell bodies. You probably picked that up in your lecture. This is gray matter of your spinal cord. So look in your lab manual and find gray matter. So if I indicated the entire butterfly here, it's just gray matter. The specific parts of it, the specific gray structures that we see, are called horns. The tips, the points of the butterfly's wings are called horns. In order to label them, we need to orient ourselves on this spinal cord. Because you will see, if you look at your lab manual, I have an anterior and a posterior gray horn. In this particular model, look at the vertebral body. That's one giveaway. This is the anterior side, so this is the anterior side of the spinal cord. This is the posterior side of the spinal cord. But not every model shows me a vertebral body. Some models I'd only see about this much. So let me tell you, show you, teach you how to identify anterior versus posterior if this is all you can see. Notice this gouge in the spinal cord right here, much wider than this one. The gouge that's wider, that my probe is in right here, this is called the anterior median fissure. The very first structure on our list, page 1. That's the anterior median fissure. On the back side, we have what's called the posterior median sulcus. It's not as wide. This one isn't a fissure, this one's a sulcus. Look for that anterior median fissure, and that will identify the anterior side of the spinal cord. This is a big deal, because now I know that this corner of the butterfly's wing is the anterior gray horn. This one is the posterior gray horn. And this one is the lateral gray horn. Posterior, lateral, anterior gray horns. Over here, anterior, lateral, posterior gray horns. Again, use this anterior median fissure to tell you the anterior side of the spinal cord. We also have what amounts to be sort of the butterfly's body here, connecting the two wings. In neurospeak, this is actually a commissure. It connects right and left sides. It's not a white commissure like, say, your corpus callosum was back in Lab 7. This is a gray commissure. Find that term in your lab manual. It's on page 1, left-hand side. The gray commissure right here. Right smack dab in the center of the thing is this hole, the central canal. That's the central canal right there. That would be filled with cerebrospinal fluid in a living spinal cord. So the gray matter, gray commissure, anterior horn, lateral horn, posterior horn, central canal right in the middle of it. Now look over on the right-hand column, and you can see the different areas of white matter that we have. The white matter, of course, is all of this spinal cord here that's not gray. White matter is referred to as columns in your spinal cord. So find on the right-hand side of page number 1 the anterior, lateral, and posterior white columns. Follow my probe around. Column, column, column. Posterior white column. How do I know that? Because it's on the posterior side, because the anterior median fissure is down here. Anterior white column. How do I know that? Because it's on the anterior side, and lateral over here on this side. Now there does come to be an area right about in here where it's a little hard to tell where the anterior ends and the lateral begins. I'm not going to put a dot somewhere in the middle there where it's hard to tell. Oh, I know you think I tried to trick you. I don't have to try to trick you. I'll put a dot firmly in the anterior white column if I want anterior white column. Here or here. Posterior white column, here and here. Lateral white column, here and here. These are the areas of white matter in the spinal cord. We'll go over these on a few different models too. But before I leave this one, I want to point out one other structure to you. It's not the greatest on this model, but it is here, right here. What you may or may not have heard in lecture yet about your spinal nerves, they have what's called an anterior or a ventral root and a posterior or a dorsal root. You will notice that once in a while the terms dorsal and posterior are used interchangeably with the nervous system, the same thing with anterior and ventral. For your lab quiz and practicals, I'm pointing the probe at you now, pay attention. For the lab quiz and practical, I will write out the answers exactly as they are in your lab manual to avoid confusion here. So you see on page 1 that it says dorsal parentheses posterior root. That's the way it'll appear on the quiz. So I don't care which one you pick, dorsal or posterior, but it's this one that's on the back side of the spinal cord. The posterior root of the spinal nerve. This yellow thing right here is the anterior root of the spinal nerve. And this bulge that we see right here, and again I will see it better on other models, is a structure called the dorsal root ganglion. I'm going to say that one again. The dorsal root ganglion, singular. Ganglia is plural. Let's take a look at another model where I can see that maybe a little better. Here we have another spinal cord model that's pretty good. It's a little bit of a relief model, meaning it's three-dimensional. This thing's actually poking off the surface to show us. But let's go through a couple of the structures we already know. Are you ready? Let's start with the butterfly. Posterior gray horn, lateral gray horn, anterior gray horn, gray commissure, central canal. I think you can get that. Anterior white column, lateral white column, posterior white column. Notice the wider anterior median fissure right there. Easy to see. The reason I show you this model, let me zoom out, because the spinal cord models are fairly similar to each other. This one actually shows me extending further out here my spinal nerve. Whoops. This one actually shows me extending out further a spinal nerve. That's right here where the tip of my probe is. The spinal nerve has an anterior or a ventral root right here, which is actually coming out. These are mostly motor impulses. And then it has a dorsal or a posterior root going in. Those are mostly sensory impulses. And on the dorsal side, I have this bulge right here. Notice it on each side. I have one on both sides. There's another one right there. That is the dorsal root ganglion. One right here, one right there. Ganglion is singular. And then here's the other, spinal nerve. So don't say spinal nerve until the two roots have joined. Here, this is the spinal nerve. This is actually the ventral or anterior root of a spinal nerve, is the way we would say that. So, follow along with my probe. The dorsal or posterior root, the anterior or ventral root, the dorsal root ganglion, and the dorsal root ganglion. And then out here, this is a spinal nerve. I have another model similar to this. Actually, I have a couple more models similar to this. Let's look at those. Let's look at this nice model of the spinal cord. It couldn't really decide if it wanted to be a 3D relief model or not, but we can still see many of the same structures. Notice the very easy to identify anterior median fissure right there, which makes this the anterior gray horn, lateral gray horn, posterior gray horn, posterior gray horn. And then for the columns, we have the anterior white column right there, lateral white column right here, posterior white column right there. Gray commissure, and the central canal's a little tough to see unless I rotate it sideways. You see this gouge right there? That's the central canal on this particular model. What's very nice on this model is the anterior or ventral root, which, remember for your lecture, is mostly motor in function, and the posterior or dorsal root, which is sensory in function, and that's the one, the dorsal root, that has the bulge on it, the dorsal root ganglion. So two things that you can use to help orient a spinal cord model. The dorsal root ganglion is on the dorsal side of the model. The anterior median fissure is on the anterior side of the model. And I can also see a very nice piece of spinal nerve right here. One more model in this same family. This one's a little more colorful. There's a reason for that. I'll tell you why it is in a moment, but you don't need to know it for your lab quiz. I see that anterior median fissure, so I know anterior side. The horns are a little tougher to see on this one. Anterior gray horn, see the point right here, lateral gray horn, posterior gray horn. Anterior white column, lateral white column, posterior white column. Ventral root, dorsal root, like that. Now, what's the point of these colored areas? These are different nerve tracts running down, typically on the front side, and up, typically on the back side, pathways of axons. That's why this is white matter, because these are all axons here. So these nervous areas are, axon, 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 like that, and this is a tract that has a name, and neurologists will memorize it. You get to memorize some of them in your lecture, I'm sure. But none of that is required for you to name on your lab quiz. We just have the big structures here. And then look at the side. If I continue out with my anterior root to the spinal nerve, dorsal root ganglion, right there. So go over these several times. I think these spinal cord models are pretty decent, and they show us a lot of the structures. So you'll see this, and the same rule applies as always does for our online labs. If I show it to you here in the instructional video or in the practice video, fair game for a quiz. Now we come to one of my personal favorite spinal cord models. Not because it shows every single thing, because it doesn't, but it does show some things particularly well, and I think it's just a very cool three-dimensional model. And no, that does not mean I'm going to ask more questions from this one than I ask from the others. So I could see a very tall looking butterfly here in this spinal cord section. But nobody's going to use this to ask you things that I can ask better on those other models that we already saw. This model is particularly good for some of the things outside the spinal cord. So notice first, I can see a very excellent sympathetic chain. And remember the way this works. One of these is a sympathetic ganglion. More than one is a sympathetic chain, And as I told you before, notice how it's on each side of the spinal cord. We have an anterior view here. Look at these vertebral bodies. What I like about this model is it shows me some of the structures shooting off of the spinal cord. It's very similar to the artwork you have at the bottom of page 1, so make sure you take a look at that. Let me tilt it a little bit for you so I can see coming out of the spinal cord my ventral or anterior and dorsal roots. And I can see those things joining up to form my spinal nerve right here. But I want you to look at this model very closely, and I'm going to change the camera angle for us. So here's maybe a little bit better angle of this very same model. So notice my anterior and posterior roots, my spinal nerve, and then what I want you to see is that the spinal nerve branches right away into two sections. Right here. Two big branches. The smaller branch, this is called the dorsal because it goes to the backside, dorsal ramus. The larger one is called the ventral ramus. So here are my two roots, my spinal nerve, and it only extends a very short distance, and then it branches into a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. I can see those on the diagram if you cared to label it. Dorsal ramus right there, ventral ramus is the bigger one right here. Look at the model again. These are the ventral ramuses, dorsal ramuses. And between what's really this ventral ramus and the sympathetic chain here, I have two nervous structures here that are also seen on the diagram here and here. So notice the sympathetic chain, dorsal root, ventral root, dorsal root ganglion, like that. These two structures here and here are the branch or the ramus communicators. The gray ramus communicans and the white ramus communicans. How do I tell them apart on a model where both of them are yellow? And you'll see these diagrammed in your textbook. Look at them to understand the difference between preganglionic and postganglionic neurons, but you may not know anything about that yet. So let me give you a quick little lab trick. See the butterfly? What color is the butterfly? Gray. Which one of these two branches is closer to the butterfly? This one. That's the gray ramus communicans. That makes the other one out here the white ramus. Sorry about the squeaky. Let me try to show you again. See the gray butterfly? Gray ramus communicans, rubbing my thumb on it. Farther away, rubbing my thumb on it now, the white ramus. So whichever one is closer to the gray butterfly, so you get it, is the gray ramus communicans. And for lab, you just have to know the name. Gray, white ramus communicans. branching off of that ventral ramus. So the two branch communicators, gray under my thumbnail, ramus communicans, white ramus communicans. Sympathetic ganglion, sympathetic chain. Dorsal ramus, ventral ramus. Rewind, watch that a few times. Very nice model for some of these structures just outside the central nervous system. So let's talk a little histology of the spinal cord. Now I had to capture a micrograph and put it into a Word document so that you could see the whole thing, because in cross-section this is just simply too big to appear on my super powerful projecting microscope. You could see a whole section of a small spinal cord if you were actually here using one of the standard lab scopes, but I had to do the best I could, improvise. That's the way we get by nowadays. But you will notice this thing looks a lot, in fact, pretty much exactly like the spinal cord models. That's one nice thing about the spinal cord. It just looks like the spinal cord. So let's talk about these structures. First, you see right here the anterior median fissure. Notice it looks a little thicker, a little wider than the sulcus on the backside. Generally speaking, the anterior horn is a little wider. That can help you out. And this particular slide also shows me a dorsal root ganglion. So I've got the anterior median fissure, which makes this the anterior white column, this the lateral white column, this the posterior white column. I can see the hole right in the middle is my central canal. I also have to know the gray commissure, which is the body of my butterfly. And then the tips of the wings, which aren't as defined here, I can definitely see the posterior or the dorsal gray horn and the anterior or ventral gray horn. The lateral, a little bit weak on this slide if you were to ask me, but I grabbed up another micrograph too. Let's take a look at it. I can see it a little better here. So anterior gray horn, lateral gray horn, posterior gray horn. Central canal, anterior median fissure, column, 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 posterior white column, lateral white column, anterior white column. Spinal cord. Now let's talk about some of these peripheral nerves that you have to know the names of. And let's begin with the arm. So you see I have our good old muscular arm laid out in front of us. And I sort of prefer the arm models for these nerves because, one, the nerves really stand out, and two, I have good anatomical landmarks. There are some other models that could be used for these that some other instructors might prefer, but let's take a quick look around. I don't see any other instructors here, so it looks like I win. Sort of a captive audience kind of thing, a vote of one. So we will use this muscular arm for the peripheral nerves that we have to know from the upper limb. So I'm on the left-hand side of page 2. About halfway down, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 nerves that you have to know on this model right here. Let's start with the easy ones. In the forearm, you can see I have removed the flexor digitorum superficialis, the palmaris longus, flexor carpi radialis muscles from this side. They're gone. I only throw those in there to irritate you from lab number 6. More importantly, I can see the thumb and the pinky. So I can very quickly determine which nerve is the radial nerve and which nerve is the ulnar nerve. The ulnar nerve is this great big one right here that runs down the pinky finger side. Obviously for us. Right here, see the thumb, see the pinky. Ulnar nerve right here. That means that the radial nerve must run down the thumb side, of course, because that's where the radius is. And if I rotate this model over, I can see this nice superficial branch of the radial nerve right here that we'll go with. If I take off the brachioradialis muscle, I can see more of it. Radial nerve all along right here, everybody, on the thumb side. And what's this great big honker of a nerve right between them? That is the median nerve. So pretty easy once you see good old thumpkin here. Radial nerve, median nerve, and ulnar nerve. Look at where this median nerve runs right through the wrist. Think of that when you think of people with carpal tunnel issues. The median nerve. In the upper part of the arm, the brachial region, we've got two other nerves to know the names of, and I can see them both in this view right here. First, this little branch shooting off, going right to the subscapularis. See that? My teres major, it actually goes down and has branches that go between them. This is the axillary nerve. Let me zoom in a little bit. Axillary nerve right here. And this other one that I can see deep down here, this thing, that is the musculocutaneous nerve. Goes through your muscles and then to your skin. So, musculocutaneous nerve right there, axillary nerve right there. Use the subscapularis muscle as your landmark to know the difference. Axillary nerve, musculocutaneous. This one actually dives down, and in nervous lingo they say it pierces the coracobrachialis muscle right here, runs between the biceps brachii and the brachialis. It actually ends up going to the other side here, and you can see it poking out right here. That's where it ends as the cutaneous nerve. So this is that last little bit of musculocutaneous nerve. So once again, I have the musculocutaneous deep into the armpit. I can see a nice branch right there, goes right into the coracobrachialis muscle, and the axillary nerve right there. Now we have some peripheral nerves of the leg. So you see I have a standard muscular leg model here. I've put it on a chair so that we can see this upper leg area right here nicely for us to learn some of these nerves. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them in the lower limb as well. Starting out with the obturator nerve. Now remember, the obturator foramen was a hole right in this os coxa, this pelvic bone here. The obturator nerve goes right through that hole. It is not this one. This is the femoral nerve. Notice it running right between the psoas major and the iliacus muscle, but it exits into the leg right here, not the obturator. I have to keep rotating and find this nerve right here. This one goes through the obturator foramen, which is right under this mass of muscle here. So this one is the obturator nerve. In fact, a way to think about these three nerves that we see up here, if we go from anterior to posterior, I have the femoral nerve right here, anterior most of our three, the obturator nerve, which is in the middle, and then this big thing back here is the sciatic nerve. So notice the femoral nerve runs down into the leg on the front side, extends down, branching out, motor-wise, serving some of the vastus muscles. This one's the femoral nerve. Passing by the obturator again under my thumb. And then on the back side of this leg, once the gluteus maximus muscle is removed, I can see very obviously this giant sciatic nerve, which is actually two nerves together, two main nerves together, sheathed as one. The sciatic nerve extending down the back side, and watch as I allow my camera to fall. Do you see how the sciatic nerve branches above your knee into this bigger central branch called the tibial nerve, and this one going over to your fibula called the common fibular nerve. Sciatic when they're still together, tibial as it continues straight down, common fibular going over here to the fibula. Now remember, for these peripheral nerves, you just need to name them when you see them. Or I guess I should say, name them when I point them out to you. You could see right here when I turn the light down and focus a little bit for us, a perfectly nice slide of a peripheral nerve. Now what you want to keep in mind as we look at this list of very few structures we have to know for the peripheral nerve, a nerve is connective tissue surrounding bundles of axons. These are wires encased in connective tissue. And we have 3 layers of connective tissue to know the names of. First, what I see here in this slide is very loose connective tissue around the outside, surrounding the entire nerve, is epineurium. Just like in a muscle, you learned in lecture, each of these bundles of fibers or axons is a fascicle. So these are all fascicles of different sizes. And surrounding each fascicle is perineurium. This is perineurium. And then the fascicle, what you can see as individual dark dots here, these are the axons surrounded by endoneurium. Let me try to jump up in magnification for us. Maybe we can see it a little better. So look specifically at this fascicle right here. You will notice staining darkly in this preparation a little circle. That's the boundary of the axon, and then the tissue surrounding it is endoneurium. That's the endoneurium. What we see staining so darkly here in this particular preparation is that myelin sheath surrounding that axon. So myelin sheath and axon, differentiating them in this particular slide, you can't really do that. So I couldn't point at, say, this thing and say, which one is it? It doesn't work like that. That wouldn't be fair, and I want to be at least a little bit fair. Maybe not totally fair, but a little fair. So notice the lighter colored surrounding tissue, endoneurium. This would all be perineurium. And then the very dark circle right there, we'll just call that the axon in this peripheral nerve slot. Okay, A&P students, what we're doing now are a few backyard reflex tests. Because who doesn't do reflex tests in their backyard? I know I do. So it's just me, yours truly, giant science nerd, here with a volunteer who's an even bigger science nerd. In fact, you might remember me making reference to this. This is the guy who screwed up my rotator cuff oh so many years ago, but has happily volunteered to help us with our reflex tests. So the first three that we will perform are autonomic nervous system reflex tests. The pupillary light reflex, the ciliospinal reflex, and the oculocardiac reflex. The first reflex test, pupillary light, many of you are probably familiar with, requires us to have a pen light or a flashlight and a test subject who keeps their eyes open real wide, and then I shine the light into their pupil looking for a response. And this person shows me a perfectly normal response. When the light is shined into his pupil, the pupil constricts. Perfectly normal response for the pupillary light reflex test. The second ANS reflex, or autonomic reflex we have, is called the ciliospinal reflex test. This one requires me to grab the back of my test subject's neck and pinch it. The problem some people have is they don't pinch it hard enough. You have to pinch it hard enough so our test subject would yelp a little bit if they weren't actually in public, to cause a little bit of pain. And again, I look at the pupil to look for a pupillary response for this reflex. So we'll try this one time. Put your hand right on the neck of your test subject while looking at their pupil. Give it a good squeeze. Here we go on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. And a good little pain and a perfectly normal response from this person again. The pupils dilated. Now, the last autonomic reflex test we have is one called the oculocardiac reflex, where I, the tester, first have to find a person's pulse, which I have right now. Then I have my test subject, when I tell them to, press on their own eyeballs in an effort to elicit this reflex. I will continue to monitor heart rate by taking the pulse and check for a response. So, test subject, go ahead and apply gentle but firm pressure to your own eyeballs. Okay, you may stop. And this test subject had a normal response, which was heart rate went down. This is a very normal response. Now, the last two reflexes, ciliospinal and oculocardiac, might require a little explanation. The ciliospinal reflex test, causing pain in our test subject, causes them to have a sympathetic nervous system response. Their pupils dilate, ready to run, fight, flight, or freeze response. Consider that when you hear about it in your lectures. The last ANS reflex test we had, oculocardiac, helps us to know that just behind the person's eyeballs, there are some baroreceptors, not as big or major as the ones we have in our aorta, but certainly pressure receptors. And by pressing on the eyeballs, increases blood pressure in those blood vessels, and the normal response is to reduce heart rate because blood pressure has just gone up. This is why you might see some people, when under stress, very anxious, they might rub their eyes as a reflexive action, which helps calm us down a little bit. Just don't press too hard because it's an eyeball. Now we'll move into our 3 somatic reflexes. Okay, the first of our 3 somatic reflex tests is the classic patellar reflex or knee-jerk reflex. Using a reflex hammer, I strike my test subject's patellar tendon, good and hard, do it like you mean it, and watch for a response. Now remember, a somatic reflex is one where skeletal muscles are the effector for the reflex, in this case, the quadriceps group. This one is a little tough because the test subject can control it. If our test subject wanted to, he could extend his knee a lot, attempting to kick the tester. If this particular test subject does that, then something like a lack of allowance or no more use of the family car is what would happen. But let's give it a shot. So relax your legs, please. Sir, nice and relaxed. I find the patellar tendon and simply strike it with my reflex hammer. Perfectly normal response, a slight extension of the knee, the patellar reflex. For our second somatic reflex, we have what's called the Achilles reflex or the calcaneal reflex. So I'm going to use this same reflex hammer and strike the test subject's Achilles or calcaneal tendon. The hard part of this reflex test is to make sure that your test subject relaxes their leg, doesn't exert any control over these skeletal muscles. So I find the Achilles tendon, strike it with the hammer, and you can notice right here in my test subject, I get a small plantar flexion at the ankle, totally normal response here as well. For our last somatic reflex, we have what's called the Babinski reflex. Sometimes you may hear it referred to as the toe fanning reflex. For this reflex test, I use the other end of my reflex hammer, and I simply scratch it along the bottom of my test subject's foot. I like to go toward the medial side, heel toward the big toe, and I look for a response. Because it's somatic, again, I want the test subject to stay nice and relaxed. Don't pay any attention to what I'm doing. In fact, I'll even direct him, look away if you would, sir. Don't watch me. And I simply perform this several times. And what you see in my test subject is perfectly normal, meaning no response at all. In somebody over the age of about 2, I expect the Babinski reflex test to be absent, or a Babinski sign to be absent. Clinically, it's probably better not to say positive or negative. A lot of people say that by convention. But a Babinski sign that was positive or present, there would be dorsiflexion and fanning of the toes, spreading the toes out, abducting them. If it's negative or absent, I see nothing at all, or maybe even a small plantar flexion of his toes. But what I do not want to see in anybody over the age of 2 is dorsiflexion or spreading of the toes. That would be a present Babinski sign. That's an indicator of central nervous system damage in anybody not an infant or a very, very young child. If a person's an older child or an adult, I would not want to see that. So I expect it to be absent, that's the terminology we'll use, in anybody over 2, present in anybody younger than 2. So this one is absent or negative, exactly what I would like to see. Next, we will perform a few tests on our subject's cerebellum to see how it's functioning. These are the series of tests that I mentioned you may notice some law enforcement officer performing on a subject testing for their posture, balance, and motor coordination. All the test subject has to do is whatever I tell him right now. So, from the lab manual, first, I would like to have you stretch both of your arms out to the sides and begin snapping your fingers, please. Can you snap your fingers? No. The test subject said, give it a shot. Hands up. Snap your fingers. Eat. There you go. Perfectly good. Cerebellum test. Next, I would like you to turn to the side, please. And I would like you to walk straight ahead, heel to toe, heel to toe. Turn around and do the same thing again, please. I would like you to do it one more time without watching your feet this time. Do it again. Keep going. Now, would you face forward again? Now, to test your cerebellum, I would like you to close your eyes and touch your nose with the index finger of your left hand. Very nice. Can you do it with your right hand? Very nice. Now I would like you, while standing straight up, I would like you to move the heel of your right foot up and down the shin of your left leg. Look at me like that. When I say, let's get a shot of your feet. Go ahead. While standing straight up and down. Very nice. These are all tests of our subject's cerebellum, responsible for motor coordination, amongst a whole host of other things. So, a big thank you to our test subject for performing these tests for us.